details. It's a question we find quite often. There's obviously landlord-tenant relationship. The tenant is in arrears for 3 months, right? The tenant handed his keys over to the neighbor 4 months ago. And now there's still assets on the property, and the landlord needs to know that whether there is a level of abscondment, and how does a landlord deal with a tenant that may have absconded, and what if the tenant didn't abscond? So how do you make that determination? And once you do, how do you deal with the matter at hand, the issues?
Perfect. So the place to start on this particular topic is obviously to deal with why we do evictions in South Africa. Okay, so in terms of our constitution, no one may be deprived of property except by an order of a court. That's constitutional imperative. That's why we do evictions in this country. Okay, and it's very important that that principle is upheld. Okay, in South African law, we want to prevent people taking the law into their own hands. You can understand that there would be absolute chaos if that is done. And so we have these constitutional imperatives that we must bring eviction applications. That being said, South African law does not expect a landlord in circumstances where their tenant has absconded or abandoned the property completely to then bring an eviction application. So in circumstances where your tenant has clearly abandoned the property, they've left, there's no need for you to take additional steps to do an eviction application, and you as a landlord are entitled to go and take your property back in the circumstances. Okay. Now, the question of whether a tenant has absconded in the circumstances is therefore the thing that we need to determine in a particular case. Okay. Now, when I say that the law recognizes that a landlord ought not to proceed with an eviction in circumstances where the tenant has vacated, this is actually set out within the Rental Housing Act. So specifically, the Rental Housing Act deals with circumstances where a tenant has vacated a dwelling before the expiration of a lease and without notice to the landlord. The Act deems that the lease agreement has then expired at the date that the tenant has vacated the property. So there is a legislative protection for the landlord that says, if they vacated and they didn't tell you that they're going to vacate the property, okay, the lease agreement is deemed expired. And therefore, any rights of occupation that the tenant might have in that particular premises has also gone away. So they no longer have that right of occupation. Now, where this question gets a little bit tricky is with regards to how do you determine that particular factual circumstance? Because I want to be very careful about this particular topic. The mere fact that a tenant is not in occupation of a particular property at any single moment does not mean that they've vacated a property. Okay. If you can imagine, if you're a tenant and you decide you're going on holiday for 3 weeks or a month, and you're going down to the coast, you're not going to be in your particular property. I think you can see that it would be a very, very bitter circumstance if your landlord deemed that, well, you haven't been in there for 3 weeks, and therefore I'm entitled to come and say you've absconded from your premises. So it's not as simple as someone is not around for a couple of weeks or a weekend or even a day. Okay. That is not going to be sufficient. There's got to be some level of conduct or something additional that demonstrates that they've actually abandoned the property in the circumstances. And again, like all questions we do, this is going to depend on the facts of the case. Okay. In our particular case we're dealing with today, we have a circumstance where the tenant has handed over the keys to their neighbor. Okay. So they've given the keys to the neighbor. Clearly, they're not intending to use those keys any longer. Okay. And they didn't tell the neighbor, hey, listen, I'm going on holiday. Please, can you hold these for me for a period of, whatever, 3 months. If that was the case, that might change the circumstances because there's a clear intention on behalf of the tenant to come back. On top of that, the tenant has stopped paying rental for a period of 3 months. So they're not actually paying you for the use and enjoyment of the particular property, together with the fact that they've handed over the keys. And so these are two factors in this particular question that we would look at to say it shows that there might be some some abandonment of the property in the circumstances. What we're also told in terms of this question is that there is some level of assets which have been left in the premises. Okay. Now, this is also something which is a tell for, is a tenant intending to come back? Okay. Because it's very common that tenants abandon a property and leave things in that property. But what those assets are will tell you what the intention of the tenant is. Okay. And so what you want to do is you want to do an assessment of what exactly is left in that property. It's very uncommon in a residential situation for a tenant to leave expensive items, TVs, computers, cutlery, inside that particular unit. But if they've abandoned a coffee table, which looks a bit beaten up, okay, that might be a circumstance where they decided, I just don't want that coffee table in the circumstances. So again, looking at what has been abandoned in the circumstances, if you can determine it. Again, sometimes this is hard because you don't actually have access, so you can't see in. But if you have a look at the particular items on the property, this might be another tell sign to say, look, he's taken all his bedding, his cutlery, his TV, all of his towels, but he's left a coffee table. It is a tell that you can go, okay, it's very likely that he's abandoned the property in the circumstances. So what I'm saying here is there are factual circumstances where a tenant might have abandoned the property, okay, and absconded from the property. In those particular circumstances, the law doesn't expect you to bring an eviction application for want of a single coffee table in that premises. And there is an allowance that the law says, okay, it's deemed that the lease agreement was cancelled and you retain your rights in the circumstances to take back your property. Okay. But that factual circumstance is going to depend on what exactly has happened in the circumstances. So I want to be very clear to landlords, because unfortunately, we do have clients who take this kind of conversation as an interpretation of, well, they've only got some assets in the property, including their bed and their TV and everything else, and that's enough for me. That won't be enough in the eyes of the law. So please be very careful when you are approaching this topic. Talk to your attorney, okay, to make sure that they are on board with you. Your attorney is the person who's going to sit there and go, I don't agree with you, and I don't think I can pass it through a judge. And that's the right person to make the call in the circumstances. But if you are finding yourself in a circumstance where your tenants has vanished, they're uncontactable, they've handed back keys, and there's either no assets within the property or very little in value left within that particular property, you may find yourself in a circumstance where there is an absconsion. And the law does provide that in that circumstance, you go ahead and you take your property back, and you obviously re-let and mitigate your damages in the circumstances. So something to consider. But again, my warning there, please be very careful when approaching this. Please seek out legal advice from either of our officers before you make any moves in this regard. If not, to check whether this would be something that would be, something you could get through court, to take mitigating steps. So there are steps that you can take to mitigate the potential damage that you might suffer as a result if you are wrong in the circumstances. And your attorney will know how to do that. So please approach our officers before you decide to. All right. Thank you very much, Bruno. And we will see you next week.
Have a good one.
All right. Cheers.